Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's Stories. We now return to Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm by Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 26. Over the Teacups. The summer term at Wareham had ended, and Huldah Meserve, Dick Carter, and Levin Perkins had finished school, leaving Rebecca and Emma Jane to represent Riverboro in the year to come. Delia Weeks was at home from Lewiston on a brief visit, and Mrs. Robinson was celebrating the occasion by a small and select party, the particular day having been set because strawberries were ripe and there was a rooster that wanted killing. Mrs. Robinson explained this to her husband and requested that he eat his dinner on the carpenter's bench in the shed, as the party was to be a ladies' affair. "All right, it won't be any loss to me," said Mr. Robinson. "Give me beans, and that's all I ask. When a rooster wants to be killed, I want somebody else to eat him, not me." Mrs. Robinson had company only once or twice a year, and was generally much prostrated for several days afterward, the struggle between pride and parsimony being quite too great a strain upon her. It was necessary, in order to maintain her standing in the community, to furnish a good set-out, yet the extravagance of the proceeding goaded her from the first moment she began to stir the marble cake to the moment when the feast appeared upon the table. The rooster had been boiling steadily over a slow fire since morning, but such was his power of resistance that his shape was as firm and handsome in the pot as on the first moment when he was lowered into it. "He ain't going to give up," said Alice, peering nervously under the cover, "and he looks like a scarecrow." "We'll see whether he gives up or not when I take a sharp knife to him," her mother answered. "And as to his looks, a platter full of gravy makes a sight of difference with old roosters, and I'll put dumplings round the age. They're terrible filling, though they don't belong with boiled chicken." The rooster did indeed make an impressive showing, lying in his border of dumplings, and the dish was much complimented. The rooster did indeed make an impressive showing, lying in his border of dumplings, and the dish was much complimented when it was borne in by Alice. This was fortunate, as the chorus of admiration ceased abruptly when the ladies began to eat the fowl. "I was glad you could get over to Huldah's graduation, Delia," said Mrs. Meserve, who sat at the foot of the table and helped the chicken, while Mrs. Robinson poured coffee at the other end. She was a fit mother for Huldah, being much the most stylish person in Riverboro. Ill health and dress were, indeed, her two chief enjoyments in life. It was rumored that her elaborately curled front piece had cost $5, and that it was sent into Portland twice a year to be dressed and frizzed. But it is extremely difficult to discover the precise facts in such cases, and a conscientious historian always prefers to warn a too credulous reader against imbibing as gospel truth something that might be the basest perversion of it. As to Mrs. Meserve's appearance, have you ever in early years sought the comforting society of the cook and hung over the kitchen table while she rolled out sugar gingerbread? Perhaps then, in some unaccustomed moment of amiability, she made you a dough lady, cutting the outline deftly with her pastry knife, and then at last placing the human stamp upon it by sticking in 2 black courants for eyes. Just call to mind the face of that sugar gingerbread lady, and you will have an exact portrait of Huldah's mother, Miss Peter Meserve. She was generally called, there being several others. "How'd you like Huldah's dress, Dahlia?" she asked, snapping the elastic in her black jet bracelets after an irritating fashion she had. "I thought it was about the handsomest of any," answered Dahlia, "and her composition was first-rate. It was the only real amusing one there was, and she read it so loud and clear we didn't miss any of it. Most of the girls spoke as if they had hasty pudding to their mouths." "There was the composition she wrote for Adam Ladd's prize," explained Mrs. Meserve, "and they do say she'd have come out first instead of fourth if her subject had been different. There was 3 ministers and 3 deacons on the committee, and it was only natural they should choose a serious piece. Hers was too lively to suit them." Huldah's inspiring theme had been boys, and she certainly had a fund of knowledge and experience that fitted her to write most intelligently upon it. It was vastly popular with the audience, who enjoyed the rather cheap jokes and allusions with which it coruscated, but judged from a purely literary standpoint, it left much to be desired. Rebecca's piece won't read out loud, but the one that took the boys' prize was... "Why was that?" asked Mrs. Robinson. "Because she wa'n't graduating," explained Mrs. Cobb, "and couldn't take part in the exercises. It'll be printed with Herbert Dunn's in the school paper." "I'm glad of that, for I'll never believe it was better in Huldah's till I read it with my own eyes. It seems as if the prize ought to have gone to one of the seniors." "Well, no, Marthy, not if Ladd offered it to any of the 2 upper classes that wanted to try for it," argued Mrs. Robinson. "They say they asked him to give out the prizes, and he refused, up and down. It seems odd, his being so rich and traveling about all over the country, that he was too modest to get up on that platform." "My Huldah could have done it, and not winked an eyelash," observed Mrs. Meserve complacently, a remark which there seemed no disposition on the part of any of the company to controvert. "It was complete, though, the governor happening to be there to see his niece graduate," said Dahlia Weeks. "Land, he looked elegant. They say he's only 6 feet, but he might have been 16, and certainly did make a fine speech." "Did you notice, Rebecca, how white she was, and how she trembled when she and Herbert Dunn stood there while the governor was praising him? He'd read her composition too, for he wrote the Sawyer girls a letter about it." This remark was from the sympathetic Mrs. Cobb. "I thought 'twas kind of foolish his making so much of her when it wasn't her graduation," objected Mrs. Meserve, "laying his hand on her head and all that, as if he was a pope pronouncing benediction. But there, I'm glad the prize come to Riverboro, tanny rate, and a handsomer one never was given out from the Warham platform. I guess there ain't no end to Adam Ladd's money. The $50 would have been good enough, but he must needs go and put it into those elegant purses." "I sat so far back I couldn't see him fairly," complained Dahlia, "and now Rebecca has taken hers home to show her mother." It was kind of a gold net bag with a chain," said Mrs. Perkins, "and there was 5 $10 gold pieces in it. Herbert Dunn's was put in a fine leather wallet." "How long is Rebecca going to stay at the farm?" asked Delia. Till they get over Hannah's being married and get the house to running without her, answered Mrs. Perkins. It seems as if Hannah might have waited a little longer. Aurelia was set against her going away while Rebecca was at school, but she's obstinate as a mule, Hannah is, and she just took her own way in spite of her mother. She's been doing her sewing for a year, the awfulest coarse cutting cloth she had, but she's nearly blinded herself with fine stitching and ruffling and tucking. Did you hear about the quilt she made? It's white and has a big bunch of grapes in the center, quilted by a thimble top. Then there's a row of circle bordering round the grapes, and she done them the size of a spool. The next border was done with a sherry glass, and the last with a port glass, and all outside of that was solid stitching done in straight rows. She's going to exhibit it at the county fair. She'd better have been taking and sewing and earning money instead of blinding her eyes on such foolishness as quilted counterpanes, said Mrs. Cobb. The next thing you know, that mortgage will be foreclosed on Miss Randall, and she and the children won't have a roof over their heads. Don't they say there's a good chance of the railroad going through her place? Asked Mrs. Robinson. If it does, she'll get as much as the farm is worth and more. Adam Ladd's one of the stockholders, and everything is a success he takes hold of. They're fighting it in Augusty, but I'd back Ladd again any of them legislators if he thought he was in the right. Rebecca'll have some new clothes now, said Delia, and the land knows she needs 'em. Seems to me the Sawyer girls are getting terrible near. Rebecca won't have any new clothes out of the prize money, remarked Mrs. Perkins, for she sent it away the next day to pay the interest on that mortgage. Poor little girl, exclaimed Delia Weeks. She might as well help along her folks as spend it on foolishness, affirmed Mrs. Robinson. I think she was mighty lucky to get it to pay the interest with, but she's probably like all the Randalls. It was easy come, easy go with them. That's more than could be said of the Sawyer stock, retorted Mrs. Perkins. Seems like they enjoyed saving more than anything in the world, and it's gaining on Miranda since her shock. I don't believe it was a shock. It stands to reason she'd never have got up after it and been so smart as she is now. We had 3 of the worst shocks in our family that there ever was on this river, and I know every symptom of 'em better than the doctors. And Miss Peter Meserve shook her head wisely. Mirandy's smart enough, said Mrs. Cobb, but you notice she stays right to home, and she's more close-mouthed than ever she was. Never took a mite of pride in the prizes, I could see, though it pretty nigh drove Jeremiah out of his senses. I thought I should have died of shame when he cried hooray and swung his straw hat when the governor shook hands with Rebecca. It's lucky he couldn't get fur into the church and had to stand back by the door, for as it was, he made a spectacle of himself. My suspicion is, and here every lady stood eating and sat up straight, that the Sawyer girls have lost money. They don't know a thing about business and never did, and Mirandy's too secretive and contrary to ask advice. The most of what they've got is in government bonds, I always heard, and you can't lose money on them. Jane had the timberland left her, and Mirandy had the brick house. She probably took it awful hard that Rebecca's $50 had to be swallowed up in a mortgage instead of going towards school expenses. The more I think of it, the more I think Adam Ladd intended Rebecca should have that prize when he gave it. The mind of Hulda's mother ran towards the idea that her daughter's rights had been assailed. Land, Marthy, what foolishness you talk, exclaimed Mrs. Perkins. "You don't suppose he could tell what composition the committee was going to choose, and why should he offer another $50 for a boys' prize if he weren't interested in helping along the school? He's give Emma Jane about the same present as Rebecca every Christmas for 5 years. That's the way he does. Sometime he'll forget one of 'em and give to the other, or drop 'em both and give to some new girl," said Delia Weeks, with an experience born of 50 years of spinsterhood. "Like as not," assented Mrs. Peter Meserve, "though it's easy to see he ain't the marrying kind. There's men that would marry once a year if their wives would die fast enough, and there's men that seems to want to live alone. If Lad was a Mormon, I guess he could have every woman in North Riverboro that's a suitable age, according to what my cousins say," remarked Mrs. Perkins. "'Tain't likely he could be catched by any North Riverboro girl," demurred Mrs. Robinson. Not when he probably has had the pick of Boston. I guess Martha hit it when she said there's men that ain't the marrying kind." "I wouldn't trust any of them when Miss Wright comes along," laughed Mrs. Cobb genially. "You never can tell what and who's going to please 'em. You know Jeremiah's contrary horse, Buster. He won't let anybody put the bit into his mouth if he can help it. He'll fight Jerry and fight me till he has to give in. Rebecca didn't know nothing about his tricks, and the other day she went into the barn to hitch up. I followed right along, knowing she'd have trouble with the headstall, and I declare, if she wa'n't patting Buster's nose and talking to him, and when she put her little fingers into his mouth, he opened it so fur I thought he'd swallow her for sure. He just smacks his lips over the bit as if 'twas a lump of sugar. 'Land, Rebecca,' I says, 'how'd you persuade him to take the bit?' 'I didn't,' she says. 'He seemed to want it. Perhaps he's tired of his stall and wants to get out in the fresh air.'" Chapter 27. Vision Splendid. A year had elapsed since Adam Ladd's prize had been discussed over the teacups in Riverboro. The months had come and gone, and at length the great day had dawned for Rebecca, the day to which she had been looking forward for 5 years, as the first goal to be reached on her little journey through the world. School days were ended, and the mystic function known to the initiated as graduation was about to be celebrated. It was even now heralded by the sun dawning in the eastern sky. Rebecca stole softly out of bed, crept to the window, threw open the blinds, and welcomed the rosy light that meant a cloudless morning. Even the sun looked different somehow, larger, redder, more important than usual. And if it were only so, there was no member of the graduating class who would have thought it strange or unbecoming, in view of all the circumstances. Emma Jane stood on her pillow, woke, and seeing Rebecca at the window, came and knelt on the floor beside her. "It's going to be pleasant," she sighed gratefully. "If it wasn't wicked, I could thank the Lord. I'm so relieved in my mind. Did you sleep?" "Not much. The words of my class poem kept running through my head, and the accompaniments of the songs, and worse than anything, Mary Queen of Scots' prayer in Latin. It seemed as if adoro, imploro, ut liberes me were burned into my brain." No one who is unfamiliar with life in rural neighborhoods can imagine the gravity, the importance, the solemnity of this last day of school. In the matter of preparation, wealth of detail, and general excitement, it far surpasses a wedding. For that is commonly a simple affair in the country, sometimes even beginning and ending in a visit to the parsonage. Nothing quite equals graduation in the minds of the graduates themselves, their families, and the younger students, unless it be the inauguration of a governor at the state capitol. Wareham, then, was shaken to its very center on this day of days. Mothers and fathers of the scholars, as well as relatives to the remotest generation, had been coming on the train and driving into the town since breakfast time. Old pupils, both married and single, with and without families, streamed back to the dear old village. The two livery stables were crowded with vehicles of all sorts, and lines of buggies and wagons were drawn up along the sides of the shady roads, the horses switching their tails in luxurious idleness. The streets were filled with people wearing their best clothes, and the fashions included not only the latest thing, but the well-preserved relic of a bygone day. There were all sorts and conditions of men and women, for there were sons and daughters of storekeepers, lawyers, butchers, doctors, shoemakers, professors, ministers, and farmers at the Wareham schools, either as boarders or day scholars. In the seminary building there was an excitement so deep and profound that it expressed itself in a kind of hushed silence, a transient suspension of life, as those most interested approached the crucial moment. The feminine graduates-to-be were seated in their own bedrooms, dressed with a completeness of detail to which all their past lives seemed to have been but a prelude. At least this was the case with their bodies, but their heads, owing to the extreme heat of the day, were one and all ornamented with leads or papers or dozens of little braids, to issue later in every sort of curl known to the girl of that period. Rolling the hair on leads or papers was a favorite method of attaining the desired result, and though it often entailed a sleepless night, there were those who gladly paid the price. Others, in whose veins the blood of martyrs did not flow, substituted rags for leads, and pretended that they made a more natural and less woolly curl. Heat, however, will melt the proudest head and reduce to fiddling strings the finest product of the waving pen. So anxious mothers were stationed over their offspring, waving palm leaf fans, it having been decided that the supreme instant when the town clock struck 10 should be the one chosen for releasing the prisoners from their self-imposed tortures. Dotted or plain Swiss muslin was the favorite garb, though there were those who were steaming in white cashmere or alpaca, because in some cases such frocks were thought more useful afterwards. Blue and pink waist ribbons were lying over the backs of chairs, and the girl who had a Roman sash was praying that she might be kept from vanity and pride. The way to any graduating dress at all had not seemed clear to Rebecca until a month before. Then, in company with Emma Jane, she visited the Perkins attic, found piece after piece of white butter muslin or cheesecloth, and decided that, at a pinch, it would do. The rich blacksmith's daughter cast the thought of dotted Swiss behind her, and elected to follow Rebecca in cheesecloth, as she had in higher matters, straightway devising costumes that included such drawing of threads, such hem-stitching and pin-tucking, such insertions of fine thread tatting that, in order to be finished, Rebecca's dress was given out in sections. The sash to Hannah, waist and sleeves to Mrs. Cobb, and skirt to Aunt Jane. The stitches that went into the despised material, worth only 3 or 4 pennies a yard, made the dresses altogether lovely. And as for the folds and lines into which they fell, they could have given points to satins and brocades. The 2 girls were waiting in their room alone, Emma Jane in rather a tearful state of mind. She kept thinking that it was the last day that they would be together in this altogether sweet and close intimacy. The beginning of the end seemed to have drawn, for 2 positions had been offered Rebecca by Mr. Morrison the day before, one in which she would play for singing and calisthenics, and superintend the piano practice of the younger girls in a boarding school. The other, an assistant's place in the Edgewood High School. Both were very modest as to salary, but the former included educational advantages that Miss Maxwell thought might be valuable. Rebecca's mood had passed from that of excitement into a sort of exaltation, and when the first bell rang through the corridors announcing that in 5 minutes the class would proceed in a body to the church for the exercises, she stood motionless and speechless at the window, with her hand on her heart. "It is coming, Emmy," she said presently. "Do you remember in the mill on the floss when Maggie Tulliver closed the golden gates of childhood behind her? I can almost see them swing, almost hear them clang, and I can't tell whether I am glad or sorry." "I shouldn't care how they swung or clanged," said Emma Jane, "if only you and I were on the same side of the gate. But we shan't be. I know we shan't." "Emmy, don't dare to cry, for I'm just on the brink myself. If only you were graduating with me, that's my only sorrow. There, I hear the rumble of the wheels. People will be seeing our grand surprise now. Hug me once for luck, dear Emmy, a careful hug, remembering our butter muslin frailty." 10 minutes later, Adam Ladd, who had just arrived from Portland, was wending his way to the church, came suddenly into the main street, and stopped short under a tree by the wayside, riveted to the spot by a scene of picturesque loveliness such as his eyes had seldom witnessed before. The class of which Rebecca was president was not likely to follow accepted customs. Instead of marching 2 by 2 from the seminary to the church, they had elected to proceed thither by royal chariot. A hay cart had been decked with green vines and bunches of long-stemmed field daisies, those gay darlings of New England meadows. Every inch of the rail, the body, even the spokes, all were twined with yellow and green and white. There were 2 white horses, flower-trimmed reins, and in the floral bower, seated on maple boughs, were the 12 girls of the class, while the 10 boys marched on either side of the vehicle, wearing buttonhole bouquets of daisies and class flower. Rebecca drove, seated on a green-covered bench that looked not unlike a throne. No girl clad in white muslin, no happy girl of 17 is plain, and the 12 little country maids from the vantage ground of their setting looked beautiful as the June sunlight filtered down on their uncovered heads, showing their bright eyes, their fresh cheeks, their smiles, and their dimples. Rebecca, Adam thought, as he took off his hat and saluted the pretty panorama. Rebecca, with her tall slenderness, her thoughtful brow, the fire of young joy in her face, her fillet of dark braided hair, might have been a young muse or sibyl, and the flowery hayrack with its freight of blooming girlhood might have been painted as an allegorical picture of the morning of life. It all passed him as he stood under the elms in the old village street where his mother had walked half a century ago, and he was turning with the crowd towards the church when he heard a little sob. Behind a hedge in the garden, near where he was standing, was a forlorn person in white, whose neat nose, chestnut hair, and blue eyes he seemed to know. He stepped inside the gate and said, "What's wrong, Miss Emma?" "Oh, is it you, Mr. Ladd? Rebecca wouldn't let me cry for fearing of spoiling my looks, but I must have just one chance before I go in. I can be as homely as I like after all, for I only have to sing with the school. I'm not graduating. I'm just leaving. Not that I mind that. It's only been separated from Rebecca that I never can stand." The two walked along together, Adam comforting the disconsolate Emma Jane, until they reached the old meeting house where the commencement exercises were always held. The interior, with its decorations of yellow, green, and white, were crowded, the air hot and breathless, the essays and songs and recitations precisely like all others that have been since the world began. One always fears that the platform may sink under the weight of young platitudes uttered on such occasions. Yet one can never be properly critical, because the sight of the boys and girls themselves, those young and hopeful makers of tomorrow, disarms one's scorn. We yawn desperately at the essays, but our hearts go out to the essayists all the same, for the vision splendid is shining in their eyes, and there is no fear of the inevitable yoke that the years are so surely bringing them. Rebecca saw Hannah and her husband in the audience. Dear old John and Cousin Ann also, and felt a pang at the absence of her mother, though she had known there was no possibility of seeing her, for poor Aurelia was kept at Sunnybrook by cares of children and farm, and the lack of money either for the journey or for suitable dress. The Cobbs she saw too. No one indeed could fail to see Uncle Jerry, for he shed tears more than once, and in the intervals between the essays descanted to his neighbors concerning the marvelous gifts of one of the graduating class whom he had known ever since she was a child. In fact, had driven her from Maplewood to Riverboro when she left her home, and he had told mother the same night that there wa'n't nary young, and he had told mother that same night that there wa'n't nary rung on the ladder of fame that that child wouldn't mount before she got through with it. The Cobbs, then, had come, and there were other Riverboro faces. But where was Aunt Jane in her black silk, made over especially for this occasion? Aunt Miranda had not intended to come, she knew, but where, on this day of days, was her beloved Aunt Jane? However, this thought, like all others, came and went in a flash, for the whole morning was like a series of magic lantern pictures, crossing and recrossing her field of vision. She played, she sang, she recited Queen Mary's Latin prayer like one in a dream, only brought to consciousness by meeting Mr. Aladdin's eyes as she spoke the last line. Then at the end of the program came her class poem, Makers of Tomorrow, And there, as on many a former occasion, her personality played so great a part that she seemed to be uttering Miltonic sentiments instead of schoolgirl verse. Her voice, her eyes, her body breathed conviction, earnestness, emotion, and when she left the platform, the audience felt that they had listened to a masterpiece. Most of her hearers knew little of Carlyle or Emerson, or they might have remembered that the one said, "We are all poets when we read a poem well," and the other, "'Tis the good reader makes the good book." It was over. The diplomas had been presented, and each girl, after giving furtive touches to her hair, slight tweaks to her muslin skirts, and caressing pats to her sash, had gone forward to receive the roll of parchment with a bow that had been the subject of anxious thought for weeks. Rounds of applause greeted each graduate at this thrilling moment, and Jeremiah Cobb's behavior, when Rebecca came forward, was the talk of Wareham and Riverboro for days. Old Mrs. Webber vowed that he, in the space of 2 hours, had worn out her pew more, the carpet, the cushions, and woodwork, more than she had by sitting in it for 40 years. Yes, it was over. And after the crowd had thinned a little, Adam Ladd made his way to the platform. Rebecca turned from speaking to some strangers and met him in the aisle. "Oh, Mr. Aladdin, I am so glad you could come. Tell me." And she looked at him half shyly, for his approval was dearer to her and more difficult to win than that of the others. "Tell me, Mr. Aladdin, were you satisfied?" "More than satisfied," he said. "Glad I met the child, proud I know the girl, longing to meet the woman." Chapter 37. The Inevitable Yoke. Rebecca's heart beat high at this sweet praise from her hero's lips. But before she had found words to thank him, Mr. and Mrs. Cobb, who had been modestly biding their time in a corner, approached her, and she introduced them to Mr. Ladd. Where is Aunt Jane?" she cried, holding Aunt Sarah's hand on one side and Uncle Jerry's on the other. "I'm sorry, lovely, but we've got bad news for you." "Is Aunt Miranda worse?" "She is. I can see it by your looks." And Rebecca's color faded. "She had a second stroke yesterday morning, just when she was helping Jane lay out her things to come here today. Jane said you want to know anything about it till the exercises was all over, and we promised to keep it secret till then." "I will go right home with you, Aunt Sarah. I must just run to tell Miss Maxwell, for after I had packed up tomorrow, I was going to Brunswick with her. Poor Aunt Miranda, and I have been so gay and happy all day, except that I was longing for Mother and Aunt Jane." "There ain't no harm in being gay, lovely. There ain't no harm in being gay, lovey. That's what Jane wanted you to be. And Miranda's got her speech back, for your aunt has just sent a letter saying she's better, and I'm going to set up tonight, so you can stay here and have a good sleep and get your things together comfortably tomorrow. I'll pack your trunk for you, Becky dear, and attend to all our room things," said Emma Jane. who had come towards the group and heard the sorrowful news from the brick house. They moved into one of the quiet pews. They moved into one of the quiet side pews, where Hannah and her husband and John joined them. From time to time, some straggling acquaintance or old schoolmate would come up to congratulate Rebecca and ask why she had hidden herself in a corner. Then some member of the class would call to her excitedly, reminding her not to be late at the picnic luncheon or begging her to be early at the class party in the evening. All this had an air of unreality to Rebecca. In the midst of the happy excitement of the last 2 days, when blushing honors had been failing thick upon her, and behind the delicious exaltation of the morning had been the feeling that the condition was a transient one, and that the burden, the struggle, the anxiety would soon loom again on the horizon. She longed to steal away in the woods with her dear old John, grown so manly and handsome, and get some comfort from him. Meantime, Adam Ladd and Mr. Cobb had been having an animated conversation. "I suppose up to Boston, girls like that one are as thick as blackberries," Uncle Jerry said, jerking his head interrogatively in Rebecca's direction. "They may be," smiled Adam, taking in the old man's mood. "Only I don't happen to know one. My eyesight's been poor is the reason she look handsomest of any girl on the platform, I suppose." "There's no failure in my eyes," responded Adam, "but that was how the thing seemed to me." "What did you think of her voice? Anything extra about it?" "Made the others sound poor and thin, I thought." "Well, I'm glad to hear your opinion, and you being a traveled man, for Mother says I'm foolish about Rebecca, and have been since the first. Mother scolds me for spoiling her, but I notice Mother ain't far behind when it comes to spoiling. Land, it made me sick thinking of them parents traveling miles to see their young ones graduate, and then when they got here, having to compare 'em with Rebecca. Goodbye, Mr. Ladd. Drop in someday when you come to Riverboro." "I will," said Adam, shaking the old man's hand cordially. "Perhaps tomorrow, if I drive Rebecca home, I shall offer to do. Do you think Miss Sawyer's condition is serious?" "Well, the doctor don't seem to know, but anyhow she's paralyzed, and she'll never walk fur again. Poor soul. She ain't lost her speech. That'll be a comfort to her." Adam left the church, and in crossing the common, came upon Miss Maxwell, doing the honors of the institution. As she passed from group to group of strangers and guests, knowing that she was deeply interested in all Rebecca's plans, he told her, as he drew her aside, that the girl would have to leave Wareham for Riverboro the next day. "That is almost more than I can bear," exclaimed Miss Maxwell, sitting down on a bench and stabbing the greensward with her parasol. Stab, 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 stab. "It seems to me Rebecca never has any respite. I had so many plans for her this next month in fitting her for her position, and now she will settle down to housework again and to the nursing of that poor, sick, cross old aunt." If it had not been for the cross old aunt, Rebecca would still have been at Sunnybrook, and from the standpoint of educational advantages, or need, or indeed advantages of any sort. She might as well have been in the Blackwoods, returned Adam. That's true, that is true. I was vexed when I spoke, for I thought an easier and happier day was dawning for my prodigy and Pearl. Our prodigy and Pearl, corrected Adam. Oh, yes. She laughed. I always forget that it pleases you to pretend you discovered Rebecca. I believe, though, that happier days are dawning for her, continued Adam. It must be a secret for the present, but Mrs. Randall's farm will be bought by the new railroad. We must have right of way through the land, and the station will be built on her property. She will receive $6,000, which, though not a fortune, will yield her $300 or $400 a year, if she will allow me to invest it for her. There is a mortgage on the land that paid, and Rebecca self-supporting. The mother ought to push the education of the oldest boy, who is a fine, ambitious fellow. He should be taken away from farm work and settled at his studies. We might form ourselves into a Randall Protective Agency Limited, mused Miss Maxwell. I confess, I want Rebecca to have a career. I don't, said Adam promptly. Of course you don't. Men have no interest in the careers of women, but I know Rebecca better than you. You understand her mind better, but not necessarily her heart. You are considering her for the moment as prodigy. I am thinking of her more as Pearl. Well, sighed Miss Maxwell whimsically. Prodigy or Pearl, the Randall Protective Agency may pull Rebecca in opposite directions, but nevertheless, she will follow her saint. That will content me, said Adam gravely. Particularly if the saint beckons your way. And Miss Maxwell looked up and smiled provokingly. Rebecca did not see her Aunt Miranda till she had been at the brick house for several days. Miranda steadily refused to have anyone but Jane in the room until her face had regained its natural look. But her door was always ajar, and Jane fancied she liked to hear Rebecca's quick, light step. Her mind was perfectly clear now, and save that she could not move, she was most of the time quite free from pain, and alert in every nerve to all that was going on within or without the house. Were the windfall apples being picked up for sauce? Were the potatoes thick in the hills? Was the corn tossling out? Were they cutting the upper field? Were they keeping fly paper laid out everywheres? Were there any ants in the dairy? Was the kindling wood holding out? Had the bank sent the cowpounds? Poor Miranda Sawyer, hovering on the verge of the great beyond, her body struck and no longer under control of her iron will. No divine visions floated across her tired brain. Nothing but petty cares and sordid anxieties. Not all at once can the soul talk with God, but He ever so near. If the heavenly language never has been learned, quick as is the spiritual sense in seizing the facts it needs, then the poor soul must use the words and phrases it has lived on and grown into day by day. Poor Miss Miranda, held fast within the prison walls of her own nature, blind in the presence of revelation because she had never used the spiritual eye, deaf to angelic voices because she had not used the spiritual ear. There came a morning when she asked for Rebecca. The door was opened into the dim, sick room, and Rebecca stood there with the sunlight behind her hands full of sweet peas. Miranda's pale, sharp face, framed in its nightcap, looked haggard on the pillow, and her body was pitifully still under the counterpane. "Come in," she said. "I ain't dead yet. Don't mess up the bed with them flowers, will ye?" "Oh no, they're going in a glass pitcher," said Rebecca, turning to the washstand as she tried to control her voice and stop the tears that sprang to her eyes. "Let me look at ye. Come closer. What dress are you wearing?" said the old aunt in a cracked, weak voice. "My blue calico." "Is your cashmere holding its color?" "Yes, Aunt Miranda." "Do you keep it in a dark closet hung on the wrong side as I told ye?" "Always." "Has your mother made her jelly?" "She hasn't said. She always had the knack of writing letters with nothing in them. What's Mark broke since I've been sick?" "Nothing at all, Aunt Miranda." "Why, what's the matter with him? Getting lazy, ain't he? How's John turning out?" "He's going to be the best of us all." "I hope you don't slap things in the kitchen because I ain't there. Do you scale the coffee pot and turn it upside down in the windowsill?" "Yes, Aunt Miranda." "It's always yes with you and yes with Jane," groaned Miranda, trying to move her stiffened body. "But all the time I lay here knowing there's things done the way I don't like 'em." There was a long pause, during which Rebecca sat down by the bedside and timidly touched her aunt's hand, her heart swelling with tender pity at the gaunt face and closed eyes. "I was dreadful ashamed to have you graduate in cheesecloth, Rebecca, but I couldn't help it nohow. You'll hear the reason sometime, and know I tried to make it up to ye. I'm afraid you was a laughing-stock." "No," Rebecca answered. "Ever so many people said our dresses were the very prettiest. They looked like soft lace. You're not to be anxious about anything. Here I am, all grown up and graduated. Number 3 in a class of 22, Aunt Miranda. And good positions offered me already. Look at me, big and strong and young, all ready to go into the world and show what you and Aunt Jane have done for me. If you want me near, I'll take the Edgewood School so that I can be here nights and Sundays to help. And if you get better, then I'll go to Augusta, for that's $100 more with music lessons and other things besides." "You listen to me," said Miranda quaveringly. "Take the best places, regardless of my sickness. I'd like to live long enough to know you'd paid off that mortgage, but I guess I shan't." Here she ceased abruptly, having talked more than she had for weeks, and Rebecca stole out of the room to cry by herself and wonder if old age must be so grim, so hard, so unchastened and unsweetened as it slipped into the valley of the shadow. The days went on, and Miranda grew stronger and stronger. Her will seemed unassailable, and before long she could be moved into a chair by the window, her dominant thought being to arrive at such a condition of improvement that the doctor need not call more than once a week, instead of daily, thereby diminishing the bill that was mounting to such a terrifying sum that it haunted her thoughts by day and dreams by night. Little by little, hope stole back into Rebecca's young heart. Aunt Jane began to clear starch, her handkerchiefs and collars and purple muslin dress, so that she might be ready to go to Brunswick at any moment when the doctor pronounced Miranda well and on the road to recovery. Everything beautiful was to happen in Brunswick. If she could be there by August, everything that heart could wish or imagination conceive, for she was to be Miss Emily's very own visitor, and sit at table with college professors and other great men. At length, the day dawned when the few clean, simple dresses were packed in the hair trunk, together with her beloved coral necklace, her cheesecloth graduating dress, her class pin, Aunt Jane's lace cape, and the one new hat which she tried on every night before going to bed. It was of white chip, with a wreath of cheap white roses and green leaves, and cost between $2 and $3, an unprecedented sum in Rebecca's experience. The effect of its glories when worn with her nightdress was dazzling enough, but if ever it appeared in conjunction with the cheesecloth gown, Rebecca felt that even reverend professors, Reverend. Rebecca felt that even reverend professors might regard it with respect. It is probable indeed that any professorial gaze lucky enough to meet a pair of dark eyes shining under that white rose garland would never have stopped at respect. Then, when all was ready, an Abijah flag at the door came a telegram. When all was ready, an Abijah flag at the door, came a telegram from Hannah. Come at once. Mother has had bad accident. In less than an hour, Rebecca was started on her way to Sunnybrook, her heart palpitating with fear as to what might be awaiting her at her journey's end. Death, at all events, was not there to meet her, but something that looked at first only too much like it. Her mother had been standing on the haymow, superintending some changes in the barn. She had been seized with giddiness, they thought, and slipped. The right knee was fractured, and the back strained and hurt, but she was conscious and in no immediate danger. So Rebecca wrote, when she had a moment, to send Aunt Jane the particulars. I don't know how 'tis, grumbled Miranda, who was not able to sit up that day. But from a child I could never lay abed without Aurelia's getting sick too. I don't know she could help falling, though it ain't any place for a woman, a haymow. But if it hadn't been that, 'twould have been something else. Aurelia was born unfortunate. Now she'll probably be a cripple, and Rebecca'll have to nurse her instead of earning a good income somewhere else. Her first duty is to her mother, said Aunt Jane. I hope she'll always remember that. Nobody remembers anything they ought to at 17, responded Miranda. Now that I'm strong again, there's things I want to consider with you, Jane. Things that are on my mind night and day. We've talked them over before, now we'll settle them. When I'm laid away, do you want to take Aurelia and the children down here to the brick house? There's an awful parcel of them. Aurelia, Jenny, and Fanny, but I won't have Mark. Hannah can take him. I won't have a great boy stomping out the carpets and ruining the furniture, though I know when I'm dead I can't hinder ye if you make up your mind to do anything. I shouldn't like to go against your feelings, especially in laying out your money, Miranda, said Jane. Don't tell Rebecca I've willed her the brick house. She won't get it till I'm gone, and I want to take my time about dying and not be hurried off by them that's going to profit by it. No, I don't want to be thanked neither. I suppose she'll use the front stairs as common as the brick, as common as the back, and like as not have water brought into the kitchen. But maybe, when I've been dead a few years, I shan't mind. She sets such store by you, she'll want you to have your home here as long as you live. But anyway, I've wrote it down that way, though Lawyer Burns's will don't hold more than half the time. He's cheaper, but I guess it comes out just the same in the end. I won't going to have the fuss man Rebecca. I want going to have the first man Rebecca picks up for a husband turning you outdoors. There was a long pause, during which Jane knit silently, wiping the tears from her eyes from time to time as she looked at the pitiful figure lying weakly on the pillows. Suddenly, Miranda said slowly and feebly, "I don't know after all, but you might as well take Mark. I suppose there's tame boys as well as wild ones. There ain't a mite of sense in having so many children. But it's a terrible risk splitting up families and farming them out here and there. They'd never come to no good, and everybody would keep remembering their mother was a Sawyer. Now, if you'll draw down the curtain, I'll try to sleep." Chapter 29. Mother and Daughter. 2 months had gone by. 2 months of steady, fagging work, of cooking, washing, ironing, of mending and caring for the 3 children, although Jenny was fast becoming a notable little housewife, quick, ready, and capable. There were months in which there had been many a weary night of watching by Aurelia's bedside, of soothing and bandaging and rubbing, of reading and nursing, even of feeding and bathing. The ceaseless care was growing less now, and the family breathed more freely, for the mother's sign of pain no longer came from the stifling bedroom, where, during a hot and humid August, Aurelia had lain, suffering with every breath she drew. There would be no question of walking for many a month to come, but blessings seemed to multiply when the blinds could be opened and the bed drawn near the window, when mother, with pillows behind her, could at least sit and watch the work going on, could smile at the past agony, and forget the weary hours that had led to her present comparative ease and comfort. No girl of 17 can pass through such an ordeal and come out unchanged. No girl of Rebecca's temperament could go through it without some inward repining and rebellion. She was doing tasks in which she could not be fully happy, heavy and trying tasks, which perhaps she could never do with complete success or satisfaction. And like promise of nectar to thirsty lips was the vision of joys she had had to put aside for the performance of dull daily duty. How brief, how fleeting had been those splendid visions when the universe seemed open for her young strength to battle and triumph in. How soon they had faded into the light of common day. At first, sympathy and grief was so keen she thought of nothing but her mother's pain. No consciousness of self interposed. No consciousness of self interposed between her and her filial service. Then, as the weeks passed, little blighted hopes began to stir and ache in her breast. Defeated ambitions raised their heads as if to sting her. Unattainable delights teased her by their very nearness, by the narrow line of separation that lay between her and their realization. It is easy for the moment to tread the narrow way, looking neither to the right nor left, upborne by the sense of right doing, but that first joy of self-denial, the joy that is like fire in the blood, dies away. The path seems dreary, and the footsteps falter. Such a time came to Rebecca, and her bright spirit flagged when the letter was received saying that her position in Augusta had been filled. There was a mutinous leap of the heart then, a beating of wings against the door of the cage, a longing for the freedom of the big world outside. It was the stirring of the powers within her, though she called it by no such grand name. She felt as if the wind of destiny were blowing her flame hither and thither, burning, consuming her, but kindling nothing. All this meant one stormy night in her little room at Sunnybrook, but the clouds blew over, the sun shone again, a rainbow stretched across the sky, while hope, clad in April green, smiled into her upturned face and beckoned her on, saying, "Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be." Threads of joy ran in and out of the gray, tangled web of daily living. There was the attempt at odd moments to make the bare little house less bare by bringing in out of doors, taking a leaf from nature's book, and noting how she conceals ugliness wherever she finds it. Then there was the satisfaction of being mistress of the poor domain, of planning, governing, deciding, of bringing order out of chaos, of implanting gaiety in the place of inert resignation to the inevitable. Another element of comfort was the children's love, for they turned to her as flowers to the sun, drawing confidently on her fund of stories, serene in the conviction that there was no limit to Rebecca's power of make-believe. In this, and in yet greater things, little as she realized it, the law of compensation was working in her behalf, for in those anxious days, mother and daughter found and knew each other as never before. A new sense was born in Rebecca as she hung over her mother's bed of pain and unrest, a sense that comes only of ministering, a sense that grows only when the strong bend toward the weak. As for Aurelia, words could never have expressed her dumb happiness when the real revelation of motherhood was vouchsafed her.
Vouchsafed.
Vouchsafe. Give or grant something to someone in a gracious or condescending manner. Vouchsafe. Grant. Disclose. Words could never have expressed her dumb happiness when the real revelation of motherhood was vouchsafed her. In all the earlier years when her babies were young, cocking cares and anxieties darkened the fireside with their brooding wings. Then Rebecca had gone away, and in the long months of absence, her mind and soul had grown out of her mother's knowledge, so that now, when Aurelia had time and strength to study her children, she was like some enchanting changeling. Aurelia and Hannah had gone on in the dull round and the common task, growing duller and duller. But now, on a certain stage of life's journey, who should appear but this bewildering being, who gave wings to thoughts that had only crept before, who brought color and grace and harmony into the dun brown texture of existence. You might harness Rebecca to the heaviest plow, and while she had youth on her side, she would always remember the green earth under her feet and the blue sky over her head. Her physical eye saw the cake she was stirring and the loaf she was kneading. Her physical ear heard the kitchen fire crackling and the tea kettle singing. But ever and anon her fancy mounted on pinions, rested itself, renewed its strength in the upper air. The bare little farmhouse was a fixed fact, but she had many a palace into which she now and then withdrew. Palaces peopled with stirring and gallant figures belonging to the world of romance. Palaces not without their heavenly apparitions too, breathing celestial counsel. Every time she retired to her citadel of dreams, she came forth radiant and refreshed, as one who has seen the evening star, or heard sweet music, or smelled the rose of joy. Aurelia could have understood the feeling of a narrow-minded and conventional hen who was brought a strange, intrepid duckling into the world, but her situation was still more wonderful, for she only compared her sensation to those of some quiet brown dorking who has brooded an ordinary egg and hatched a bird of paradise. Such an idea had crossed her mind more than once during the past fortnight, and it flashed to and fro this melon October morning when Rebecca came into the room with her arms full of goldenrod and flaming autumn leaves. "Just a hint of the fall styles, Mother," she said, slipping the stem of a gorgeous red and yellow sapling between the mattress and the foot of the bed. This was leaning over the pool, and I was afraid it would be vain if I left it there too long, looking at its beautiful reflection, so I took it away from danger. Isn't it wonderful? How I wish I could carry one to poor Aunt Miranda today. There's never a flower in the brick house when I'm away. It was a marvelous morning. The sun had climbed into a world that held in remembrance only a succession of golden days and starlit nights. The air was fragrant with ripening fruit, and there was a mad little bird on a tree outside, the door nearly bursting his throat with joy of living. He had forgotten that summer was over, that winter must ever come, and who could think of cold winds, bare boughs, or frozen streams on such a day? A painted moth came in at the open window, and settled on the tuft of brilliant leaves. Aurelia heard the bird and looked from the beauty of the glowing bush to her tall, splendid daughter, standing like young spring with golden autumn in her arms. Then suddenly she covered her eyes and cried, "I can't bear it. Here I lie chained to this bed, interfering with everything you want to do. It's all wasted. All my saving and doing without, all your hard study, all Miranda's outlay, everything that we thought was going to be the making of you." "Mother, Mother, don't talk so, don't think so," exclaimed Rebecca, sitting down impetuously on the floor by the bed and dropping the goldenrod by her side. "Why, Mother, I'm only a little past 17. This person in a purple calico apron with flower on her nose is only the beginnings of me. Do you remember the young tree that John transplanted? We had a dry summer and a cold winter, and it didn't grow a bit, nor show anything of all we did for it. Then there was a good year, and it made up for lost time. This is just my little rooting season, Mother, but don't go and believe my day is over, because it hasn't begun. The old maple by the well that's in its 100th year had new leaves this summer, so there must be hope for me at 17. You can put on a brave face on it. You can put a brave face on it, sobbed Aurelia. But you can't deceive me. You've lost your place. You'll never see your friends here, and you're nothing but a drudge. I look like a drudge, said Rebecca mysteriously. with laughing eyes. But I really am a princess. You mustn't tell, but this is only a disguise. I wear it for reasons of state. The king and queen who are at present occupying my throne are very old and tottering, and are going to abdicate shortly in my favor. It's rather a small kingdom, I suppose, as kingdoms go, so there isn't much struggle for it in royal circles, and you mustn't expect to see a golden throne set with jewels. It will probably be only of ivory, with a nice screen of peacock feathers for a background. But you shall have a comfortable chair very near it, with quantities of slaves to do what they call in novels your lightest bidding. Aurelia smiled in spite of herself, and though not perhaps wholly deceived, she was comforted. I only hope you won't have to wait too long for your thrones and your kingdoms, Rebecca, she said, and that I shall have a sight of them before I die. But life looks very hard and rough to me, with what your Aunt Miranda a cripple at the brick house, me another here at the farm, you tied hand and foot, first with one and then with the other, to say nothing to Jenny and Fanny and Mark. You've got something of your father's happy disposition, or it would weigh on you as it does on me. Why, mother, cried Rebecca, clasping her knees with her hands. Why, mother, it's enough joy just to be here in the world on a day like this, to have the chance of seeing, feeling, doing, becoming. When you were 17, mother, wasn't it good just to be alive? You haven't forgotten. No, said Aurelia, but I wasn't so much alive as you are. Never in the world. I often think, Rebecca continued, walking to the window and looking out at the trees. I often think how dreadful it would be if I were not here at all, if Hannah had come, and then, instead of me, John and Jenny and Fanny and the others, but no Rebecca, never any Rebecca. To be alive makes up for everything. There ought to be fears in my heart, but there aren't. Something stronger sweeps them out, something like a wind. Oh, I see. There's Will driving up the lane, mother, and he ought to have a letter from the brick house.